The rain came down in heavy, cold sheets over the coastal town of Bar Harbor, Maine. On the night Maeve Barlow did the most reckless thing she had ever done in her 22 years of quiet living. She pulled her wool cloak tight around her shoulders, stepped out of the old hired town car, and walked up the stone steps of the grand estate on the cliff. Water streamed off the granite gargoyles near the entrance, and the wind from the Atlantic Ocean howled through the pines. Maeve did not hesitate. She lifted the heavy bronze knocker and struck the thick oak door 3 times, the sound echoing over the crash of the waves below. She was entirely alone, her boots soaked through, and her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face remained perfectly still. Inside the Barlow family home 20 minutes ago, there had been nothing but screaming and panic. Maeve had found the brief note left on her younger sister Chloe's dressing table next to a discarded lace veil. Chloe had fled into the night with a local lobsterman, leaving behind a ruined wedding and a family facing total financial destruction. The man Chloe was supposed to marry was not an ordinary citizen. He was Cassian, a reclusive billionaire who owned half the properties in the county and ruled the hidden night society as the Vampire King. He held the mortgages to the Barlow family land, the loans on their fishing boats, and the notes on their house. Without the marriage agreement, he had the legal right to take everything by sunrise, leaving Maeve's parents with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Maeve had watched her mother faint, and her father pour a glass of whiskey with shaking hands, and then she had simply taken the keys, grabbed the note, and left. The heavy door swung open with a slow, scraping sound. A tall, thin butler with graying hair and a perfectly pressed black suit stood in the warmth of the entryway. He looked at Maeve's dripping cloak, her messy hair escaping its pins, and the mud on her boots with the expression of a man who had been trained for every situation except this one. Maeve stepped inside before he could tell her to leave, her wet shoes leaving dark prints on the white marble floor. She shook the hood back from her face and looked the butler directly in the eye, her voice calm and steady despite the chill in her bones. She told him that she needed to see his master immediately, and that it was a matter of survival for her family. The butler bowed his head slightly and guided her into a massive, high-ceilinged foyer. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and a grand staircase curved down from a shadowed gallery above, like something from an old painting about dark choices. Maeve stood in the center of the room, water pooling around her feet, and waited in the quiet house. A few moments later, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs and began to descend. He did not hurry, moving with a silent, effortless grace that made Maeve realize the rumors about his true nature were entirely real. Cassian was tall, with stark white hair that caught the dim light of the chandeliers, and skin so pale it looked like carved marble. His eyes were the piercing blue of ice under a winter sky, completely devoid of human warmth. He reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped 5 paces away from her. His gaze moved over her face, taking in her plain features, her damp clothes, and the fierce determination in her eyes. He did not look angry about the missing bride. He looked entirely bored, which Maeve found far more terrifying than rage. He told her plainly that she was not Chloe Barlow, his voice low and smooth, carrying a cold resonance that vibrated in the quiet room. Maeve nodded once, and told him that she was the older sister, the one people usually forgot to mention at parties. She reached into her cloak, drew out Chloe's farewell note, and held it out to him. Cassian did not take the paper. He simply looked at it, and then looked back at her face, waiting for her to speak. Teve let her hand drop and spoke with the directness of someone who had spent her entire life managing household accounts and fixing other people's mistakes. She told him that Chloe had left the state and would not be coming back to fulfill the contract. She explained that without a bride from the Barlow family, he was within his rights to call in their debts by morning, which would destroy them completely. She looked up into his icy blue eyes, kept her chin level, and told him that she had heard he needed a bride to secure his local land holdings. Something tiny shifted in Cassian's cold expression. a faint sharpening of his gaze that lasted for only a second. He stepped closer, bringing with him a sudden chill that smelled of winter frost and deep woods. Maeve did not move back an inch, even though every instinct told her to run from the creature standing before her. He searched her face for fear, or perhaps for the greed of a woman trying to climb into a position of wealth, but he found nothing but honest necessity. A faint, humorless line formed at the edge of his pale lips as he murmured that perhaps he did need a bride, and perhaps that bride could be her. The estate lawyer was called from his bed, arriving at the house 40 minutes later, with a briefcase full of legal documents. They sat in the dark wood library while the storm rattled the window panes. The paperwork was amended quickly, Chloe's name crossed out and Maeve's name written in its place, in clear, elegant script. Maeve signed her name with a steady hand, the same way she signed for deliveries of groceries and firewood at home. Cassian signed his name without a single word or gesture of celebration. By 11 o'clock past midnight, the papers were stamped, the witnesses from the household staff had signed, and Maeve was legally bound to the Vampire King. After the lawyer left, Cassian sat across from her by the dying fire and delivered his terms with the cold clarity of a judge reading a sentence. He told her that they were bound by law and duty, and that she would manage the household staff and stand beside him when town events required his presence. Beyond that, he told her never to expect affection or warmth from him because he did not possess those things to give. Maeve looked back at his pale face, her expression completely untroubled by his harsh words. She told him simply that she had never expected affection from anyone, so she would not miss it here. Cassian went entirely still, his icy eyes widening just a fraction as he absorbed her plain answer. She meant it completely, speaking with the ease of a person stating a simple fact about the cold Maine weather. Her parents had spent 20 years focusing entirely on Chloe, the beautiful daughter, the talented one, the one worth showing to the world. Maeve had always been the invisible one who kept the kitchen running, paid the bills, and stayed out of the light. She stood up from her chair and waited for the butler to show her to her room, leaving the white-haired king sitting alone in the dark library, watching her go with a look of quiet bafflement. The local weekly newspaper gave the marriage exactly 2 sentences in the social column before moving on to other gossip. The general opinion among the townspeople in Bar Harbor was that the wealthy recluse had simply settled for the plain sister after the pretty one ran away to avoid his dark reputation. One small gossip sheet called her the drab replacement, a line that Maeve read at the kitchen table on her second morning at the estate. She did not frown or cry. She simply folded the paper, set it aside, and went out to the western grounds to find the old head gardener, because the massive glass greenhouse had been left to rot for 3 years. The cliffside estate was vast and beautiful, built from heavy dark stone that had withstood a century of Atlantic gales. But the daily management of the property was a quiet disaster. The tenant ledgers had not been checked in 2 seasons. The household accounts were filled with errors from local merchants who overcharged the estate out of fear, and the 12 human servants moved through the corridors like ghosts. Maeve spent her first week simply watching, listening, and taking notes in a small leather book. By the second week, she began her work without making any announcements or calling any meetings. She spent 3 hours in the small office with Mr. Gable, the butler, going through the food invoices line by line. She did not get angry or point fingers. She merely showed him where the local grain merchant had doubled the price of flour because no one was checking the receipts. She visited the kitchen and talked with Mrs. Weaver, the cook, discovering that the kitchen was ordering massive amounts of fresh meat that went to waste every week because Cassian never touched human food. Maeve adjusted the orders immediately, cutting the waste in half and routing the saved money toward long overdue repairs on the staff quarters. The servants were initially terrified of her, expecting the new mistress to be as cold and demanding as the white-haired master of the house. But within a fortnight, they noticed that their rooms were warmer. Their new boots had arrived before the first snow, and the leaking roof over the laundry room had been fixed by a local carpenter Maeve had hired. Mr. Gable found her one rainy afternoon sitting at the small desk in the pantry, verifying the inventory of winter blankets. He looked at her with an expression that was moving slowly from professional skepticism toward something resembling deep respect. Saving the rare winter roses in the greenhouse took the most effort. The glass structures had been neglected so completely that briars and wild ivy had choked out the original plants. Maeve spent her afternoons on her knees in the dirt, wearing a pair of old canvas trousers and thick leather gloves, cutting back the dead growth and clearing the soil. Cassian found her there on a cold Tuesday afternoon when the sun was low in the sky. He stood in the shadow of the brick doorway, his white hair contrasting sharply with his black coat, watching her work with a small hand trowel. Maeve did not notice him at first. She was talking softly to a stubborn, thorny rosebush that refused to take the new wooden support she was trying to secure. Cassian watched her coax the green stem onto the trellis with infinite patience, her fingers gentle despite the thick gloves. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his cold chest, something he did not have a name for. He stepped forward into the light, his boots making no sound on the gravel floor, and remarked that most wealthy wives did not spend their days covered in dirt. Maeve looked up without a hint of embarrassment, wiping a smudge of dark soil from her cheek with the back of her sleeve. She told him that the roses were dying from pure neglect, much like the spirits of the people who worked in this house. She pressed the final vine into place and looked up at his pale, perfect face. She told him that a little honest dirt would not hurt his family name, and suggested that it might do his stiff posture some good to bend down and help her clear the roots. Cassian stared at her, his icy eyes fixed on her calm face. He was standing very straight, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He had to admit to himself that the girl had a peculiar way of speaking the absolute truth without any fear of his power. He asked her about the local carpenter she had hired and the changes she had made to the kitchen accounts. Maeve answered him in plain, specific terms that took less than 5 minutes, explaining how she had saved the estate $300 in a single week by simply paying attention to the details. That evening, they spent 2 hours in the Grand Library, sitting side by side at the massive mahogany desk to review the updated tenant ledgers. Cassian said very little, but he listened to every word she said with the deep attention of a man encountering something entirely unexpected. Through the rest of November, the atmosphere of the estate changed quietly, the way heat gradually fills a room when a fire is lit properly. The servants walked with more energy, the local wood merchant sent the correct invoices, and Cassian found himself standing by the study window more than once, watching her cross the courtyard in the gray morning light. Cassian found the letters on a cold Thursday evening in December, while looking through a box of old family documents that had been sent from the legal firm in Portland. He had intended only to check the land deeds and hand the box over to Mr. Gable, but a folder at the very bottom caught his eye. The papers inside were receipts from 6 years ago, during the worst of the winter storms, when the Barlow family nursery business had nearly gone bankrupt and their laborers had gone 3 months without a single dollar of wages. He read the receipts carefully, his pale fingers turning the old yellowed papers under the lamplight. Beneath the receipts, he found a bundle of letters from a pawnshop owner in Bangor. The letters detailed the sale of several small items over an 8-month period: a silver pocket watch, a pair of modest pearl earrings, 2 gold bands, and a small sapphire pendant that had belonged to Maeve's grandmother. The total amount gained from these sales matched the exact sum needed to pay the laborers' wages during that terrible winter. The documents were all signed with the simple initials, M.B. Cassian sat back in his chair, his mind moving through the old records the town kept about the Barlow family. Everyone in Bar Harbor believed that Chloe's charm and beauty had convinced the local bank to extend their credit during that hard winter. The family had let everyone believe that the younger sister was the savior of their business, while the true work had been done by the quiet daughter, who had stripped herself of her only inheritance to keep 20 working-class families from starving in the snow. The library door opened quietly, and Maeve walked in carrying a tray with 2 mugs of hot cider she had made herself because she knew the kitchen staff had already gone to bed. She set the tray down on the edge of the desk with her usual quiet efficiency, but stopped when she saw the look on his face. Cassian held up the old receipts from the Bangor pawn shop, his icy blue eyes fixed on her. He stated the year and the amount of the wages, his voice low and intense in the quiet room. Maeve stood perfectly still for a long moment, her face expressionless, before she let out a small, tired breath. She did not look guilty. She looked like someone who had hoped an old secret would remain buried in the past. She asked him who had told him to look for those old papers. Cassian set the receipts down on the desk between them and asked her why she had let her family take all the credit, and why she had chosen to remain an invisible shadow when she was the only one holding the entire family together. Maeve walked over to the tall window, looking out at the dark woods surrounding the estate. She told him that it did not matter who received the praise from the townspeople. It only mattered that the workers and their children had food on their tables during the freeze. She turned back to look at him, her silhouette dark against the glass, and said that she was long used to being the shadow. The outcome for the people was exactly the same, whether anyone knew her name or not. Cassian stood up from his chair and came around the massive desk, his white hair catching the silver moonlight streaming through the window. He stopped just 2 feet away from her, his pale face filled with a strange, fierce intensity that she had never seen before. He told her that her answer was the response of a woman who had been told by the people who raised her that she did not deserve to be seen. He said that it was not the truth, but rather the mark of the deep damage her family had inflicted on her. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. His skin was incredibly cold, like ice from the northern river, but Maeve did not pull away from his touch. He told her clearly that she was no shadow, and that she was the only bright, honest thing living in this entire dark valley. He looked down at her small hands held within his own, and swore that he would not stand by and watch her pretend to be invisible anymore. Maeve looked up at him, her calm composure breaking just a little at the edges, revealing a sudden, deep vulnerability that she had kept hidden for years. She looked like a person who had spent her life expecting nothing, suddenly presented with something so massive she did not know how to hold it. Before she could answer him, the sharp sound of car tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside broke the silence of the night, followed by loud, angry voices echoing from the front hall below. Mr. Gable's voice rose through the house, carrying the strained tone of a butler trying desperately to maintain his professional manners under difficult circumstances. Maeve's jaw tightened in a familiar, controlled way, and she looked at Cassian with a dry, tired smile. She told him that her family had a habit of arriving without an invitation whenever they felt they had been wronged by the world. Chloe Barlow burst into the grand parlor with the dramatic energy of a woman who had made a terrible mistake and had decided to blame everyone else for it. Her eyes were red from crying, and her expensive silk dress was damp from the rain outside. Her parents followed closely behind her, their faces pale and anxious as they looked around the wealthy room, waiting to see how the master of the house would react to their sudden appearance. Chloe stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Maeve standing next to Cassian by the fireplace. She looked at Maeve's clean clothes, her calm posture, and the keys to the estate resting on the side table. A look of sharp jealousy crossed Chloe's face before she smoothed it out into an expression of soft helplessness. She turned to Cassian, stepping forward with her hands clasped together, and told him that she had come to offer an explanation for her disappearance. She claimed that she had been confused and frightened by his dark reputation, and that the local lobsterman had taken advantage of her fear to steal her away. Maeve stepped forward before Cassian could answer, her voice cutting through her sister's dramatic performance with the sharpness of a knife. She told Chloe that she had written the farewell note herself, and that she had been perfectly clear about her desire to leave the town behind forever. Their mother stepped in then, her voice carrying a sharp warning as she told Maeve to hold her tongue and let her younger sister speak to the master of the house. Cassian did not look at Chloe with the admiration she was used to receiving from every man in the county. He looked at her with the cold indifference he reserved for columns of bad figures in his business ledgers. He told her plainly that she had made a conscious choice to leave his house on the night of their agreement, and that a choice was not the same thing as being forced. Chloe's face shifted quickly into calculation, and she turned on her older sister with a false, sweet smile. She told Maeve that she could not truly expect this ridiculous arrangement to last for more than a few weeks. She argued that the white-haired master had only married her out of pure necessity because he needed a Barlow signature on the land deeds to protect his property. She said that a marriage built on a legal mistake was not a real foundation, and that everyone in the town would always view Maeve as nothing more than a temporary substitute for the true bride. Cassian's voice did not rise in volume, but it carried a sudden, dangerous chill that made the windows rattle slightly in their wooden frames. He told Chloe that the conversation was entirely over, and that they were currently guests in his home only by the tolerance of his wife, a tolerance that he would advise them not to test any further. He looked at the parents with icy clarity, and stated that his wife's character and her position in this household were not subjects he would ever allow them to comment on. Chloe stared at him with wide, blank eyes, her face filled with genuine shock. She had spent her entire 20 years being the center of attention in every room she entered, and she had never experienced a moment where her beauty did not grant her exactly what she wanted. She looked between Cassian and Maeve, her voice shaking, as she asked him if he was truly choosing the plain sister over her. Cassian looked down at Maeve, his icy eyes softening into something resembling true warmth, as he told Chloe that he had chosen his wife the exact moment she had stood in his wet foyer, and told him the plain truth. He said that this was not a new decision, but the same one he would make every single day. He then informed the parents with minimal politeness that they could stay in the western guest rooms for the night, but that they would receive a formal letter from his lawyers regarding their debts within the week. After the family had retreated down the hallway, Cassian followed Maeve back into the quiet library and shut the heavy oak door behind them. He sat on the edge of the large mahogany desk, looking up at her as she stood by the fire. He told her that there was something he needed to tell her about a night 8 years ago, during a terrible autumn storm near the eastern boundary of her family's old forest land. He explained that he had been severely weakened and injured by a silver trap set by hunters that night, and had been sitting alone in the dark woods, expecting to die. A young girl from the village had stumbled across him in the thick brush. She had shown absolutely no fear of his white hair or his frozen skin. She had simply spoken to him with a gentle kindness he did not deserve, bound his bleeding hand with a clean piece of linen, and sat with him in the cold rain until the dark shock had passed. He paused, his eyes fixed on Maeve's face, as he explained that his local advisors had later told him the girl was Chloe Barlow, and that he had agreed to the family marriage contract partly to honor that old debt of survival. Maeve reached into her apron pocket, her fingers moving automatically towards something she always carried with her for comfort. She drew out a small, faded scrap of white cloth, its edges worn thin from years of washing. She held it out to him, and Cassian recognized the delicate, repeated leaf pattern embroidered along the border. It was the exact same needlework he had seen on the curtains in her private sitting room upstairs. A simple design she made without thinking, because it belonged to her hands alone. He looked from the cloth up to her steady gray eyes, and whispered that it had been her in the woods all those years ago. Maeve looked down at the old fabric in her fingers, and told him that he had been sitting on a wet stone bench near the old stone wall, his hand bleeding badly, and that he had not looked like a terrifying king to her. He had simply looked like a living creature in a great deal of physical pain. She said that she had only sat with him because no one should have to be alone in the dark when they are hurting. Cassian stood up, took the old cloth from her hand, and told her that her staying was the only thing that had mattered to him for 8 long years. The Barlow family did not leave the cliffside estate quietly the next morning. Harold Barlow, fueled by his younger daughter's anger and the desperate courage of a man who had lost his leverage, sent a formal demand to Cassian's legal office before noon. He demanded that the original marriage settlement be rewritten to include a monthly allowance for Chloe, claiming that the substitution of the older sister was an insult to their family name. When the legal office ignored his letters, he decided to take his grievance to the public. The annual winter assembly at the town hall was the most significant social event of the season in Bar Harbor, drawing every prominent family, merchant, and landowner from across the county. Harold Barlow spent 3 days before the gathering visiting the local taverns and shops, spreading rumors to anyone who would listen. By the time Maeve and Cassian arrived at the hall on Friday evening, the large room was already filled with low whispers and sharp, curious glances directed at the new couple. Maeve felt the cold shift in the room the moment she stepped through the double doors, her boots clicking softly on the polished hardwood floor. She kept her chin high and her shoulders straight, refusing to let the stares of her neighbors alter her steady pace. Cassian walked beside her, his white hair catching the bright light of the chandeliers, his pale features set in a hard, dangerous expression. He had stopped pretending to be indifferent to her comfort weeks ago, and his icy eyes scanned the crowd with dark warning. Harold Barlow made his move during the 3rd hour of the assembly, when the main floor was crowded with guests and the local musicians had stopped playing for a brief intermission. He stepped into the center of the room, raised his glass, and spoke in a loud, booming voice that carried to every corner of the hall. He declared to the crowd that the new Duchess of the Night Estate was a fraud who had manipulated a wealthy, distracted man to steal a marriage contract that had been promised to her sister. The large hall went completely silent, the kind of heavy, breathless quiet that happens when someone says something that can never be taken back in polite society. Maeve stood perfectly still in her plain velvet dress, her face calm and unreadable, as she had practiced her entire life. Cassian stood right beside her, his hand moving to rest gently on the small of her back. The stillness radiating from his pale frame was entirely different from hers. It was the quiet of a predatory creature preparing to strike. He looked at Harold Barlow for 5 seconds, letting the silence stretch until the older man began to shift uncomfortably on his feet. Then Cassian turned his gaze to the rest of the townspeople, his low, clear voice cutting through the quiet room with absolute authority. He told them that his wife had come to his house alone in the middle of a dangerous storm, carrying nothing but her own honesty, without knowing what kind of creature she would find behind the heavy door. The crowd held its breath as Cassian took a step forward, his white hair gleaming under the lights. He told the assembly that Maeve had asked for absolutely nothing for herself, neither wealth, nor luxury, nor public praise. He explained to the listening townspeople how she had quietly spent the past several months repairing an estate he had neglected, ensuring the local workers were paid fairly, and that the tenant cottages were made warm before the winter freeze. He looked directly at Harold Barlow as he revealed the secret from 6 years ago, telling the entire room how Maeve had sold her own grandmother's jewelry in secret so that 20 local families would not starve when the Barlow business had failed. He told them that she was the same girl who had sat with him in the dark woods 8 years ago to save his life, while her family had spent years giving the credit to the daughter who had run away the moment things became difficult. Cassian's voice filled the hall with a final, unyielding weight, as he declared that his wife had come to his home with nothing but her word and her immaculate character. He stated clearly that as of this day, every piece of land, every house, and every dollar he possessed belonged entirely to her, because she had earned the respect that no one else in her family ever could. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the local leaders, and told them that she held his absolute trust. The heavy silence lasted for a long moment after he finished speaking, until old Mr. Henderson, the town's most respected shipbuilder, slowly raised his glass toward Maeve with a nod of deep approval. Several other merchants followed his lead, and the quality of the quiet in the room changed completely, turning from malicious gossip into a collective verdict of profound respect. Harold Barlow looked at his wife in total defeat, while Chloe stared down at her shoes, realizing that their power over the quiet sister was gone forever. They left the town hall shortly after the toasts ended, stepping through the side glass doors onto the wide stone terrace that overlooked the dark Atlantic Ocean. The December air was crisp and freezing, carrying the sharp scent of salt water and pine needles from the cliffs below. The light from the warm assembly room fell in long, yellow rectangles across the gray stone terrace floor, illuminating the swirling mist rising from the sea. Maeve leaned against the stone railing, letting out a long breath she had been holding for hours. She turned to look at Cassian, her face pale in the silver moonlight, and told him softly that he did not have to say those things in front of the entire town. She noted that his public declaration would have significant consequences for her family's standing in the county. Cassian came to stand beside her, his white hair catching the winter wind, his icy blue eyes fixed on her calm face. He told her simply that the Barlows would adapt to their new reality, as they were very practiced at surviving on the efforts of others. He reached out and took her hands, his skin cold as the mountain rock, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He told her that he should have spoken his mind privately days ago in the library, when he had held her hands and seen an expression on her face that he had not been able to stop thinking about ever since. He admitted to her that he was not naturally fast at speaking about things that concerned his own heart, having lived in the quiet dark for over a century. He confessed that he was far better at dealing with legal documents and land boundaries than he was with personal truths, and explained that the language of feelings took him a great deal longer to learn. He kept his eyes locked onto hers in the pale light, and told her plainly that he loved her. The words came out without any grand architecture or poetic flourishes, spoken with the same simple honesty that she used when she spoke about the daily household accounts. Maeve stood perfectly still, watching the mist roll in from the ocean, feeling a strange, deep warmth spreading through her fingers, despite the freezing cold of his skin. An expression moved through her gray eyes that she had never allowed herself to show before. The look of a person receiving a gift they had spent a lifetime training themselves never to hope for. She looked up into his handsome, pale face and told him that she loved him too, and that she had been managing that particular feeling quietly for several weeks. Cassian let out a low, soft sound that was almost a laugh, remarking that managing things quietly was exactly what she did best. Maeve smiled up at him, her eyes bright in the darkness, and countered that someone had to keep the world running smoothly while he sat in his dark study. He drew her closer to his chest, wrapping his heavy wool cloak around her shoulders to shield her from the ocean wind, and told her that there would be no more managing things alone from the shadows. He said that he wanted a full accounting of everything she felt and thought from this moment forward, and Maeve laughed out loud, a real, surprised sound that echoed beautifully against the stone walls of the old estate. Cassian felt the sound vibrate against his chest, like sunlight breaking through a winter cloud that had been closed for 50 years. He looked down at her upturned face and decided right then that he would spend the rest of his long, immortal life finding ways to make her laugh exactly like that. The months that followed the winter assembly were, by every measure the townspeople cared to take, the most prosperous and peaceful the cliffside estate had seen in over 50 years. The cold winter storms eventually gave way to the soft green rains of a New England spring, and the thick ice along the Bar Harbor shoreline melted into the blue waters of the bay. The local tenants flourished under the new agreements Maeve had organized, which lowered their rents during the hard months in exchange for consistent maintenance of the coastal property. The 12 human servants developed what Mr. Gable described to the young kitchen maid as an unseemly level of daily contentment, which was the highest praise the elderly butler was capable of giving. The long, dark corridors of the grand stone house no longer felt like a prison for lonely ghosts. The windows were thrown open to let in the sea breeze, and the smell of fresh bread and wild herbs from Mrs. Weaver's kitchen filled the lower rooms every afternoon. Cassian developed a surprising reputation among his business associates in the city for arriving at their night meetings with an incredibly accurate and current knowledge of his local properties and the families who worked them. He had always been feared for his sharp, cold intelligence and his absolute power over the region, but now the local leaders respected him for the fair management of his lands. He allowed the townspeople to credit the improvements to good luck, never correcting them about his wife's work. Maeve spent her spring mornings coordinating the delivery of materials for the new fishing pier and visiting the village on foot, no longer hiding her ledger under her cloak. The townspeople no longer looked at her with pity or curiosity. The fishermen tipped their hats when she passed, and the women from the market often left small baskets of fresh berries or wild flowers on the estate steps as a token of appreciation for her quiet kindness. During the late afternoons, when the sun began to dip behind the western mountains and the shadows grew long across the lawn, Cassian would leave his dark quarters to sit in the shaded corner of the wide wooden porch. He would spend hours simply watching Maeve work in the expanding gardens below, his pale face relaxed as he observed her moving between the rows of green shoots, her white hair ribbon fluttering in the gentle spring wind. Their bond grew deeper through these small daily moments of shared quietness and mutual respect. They did not need grand declarations or dramatic displays of affection. They found their certainty in the way he would silently place a warm shawl over her shoulders when the evening chill rolled in, and the way she would always leave a fresh mug of herbal tea on his desk before he began his night work. The invisible daughter had finally found a home where every detail of her presence was seen and valued. On a brilliant, warm afternoon in the late days of May, Maeve walked into the grand library holding a small leather notebook filled with the final summer planting schedules for the estate grounds. The large room was flooded with golden sunlight that streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the thousands of old books lining the dark wood walls. She stopped in the doorway, observing Cassian as he stood by the center window, looking out at the western valley rather than at the legal papers piled neatly on his desk. She stepped into the room, her boots making a soft, familiar sound on the Persian rug, and remarked that he was spending an unusual amount of time watching the new rose bushes. Cassian turned slowly from the glass, his white hair gleaming in the bright afternoon light, his pale skin looking remarkably soft in the warmth of the sun. He looked at her with a quiet, steady gaze, and replied that he was not watching the roses at all, but rather the remarkable person who had brought them back to life. He said that he found her presence considerably more interesting than the stack of shipping reports waiting for his signature on the mahogany table. Maeve came to stand right beside him at the window, looking out at the massive glass greenhouse and the sprawling gardens below. The rare winter roses had survived the transition into the warm season, blooming now in a wild, generous display of deep crimson and soft white that filled the entire western lawn with their sweet scent. It was not the rigid, perfect arrangement of a formal city garden, but something far wilder and more beautiful, the way things grow when they are given the proper care, the proper soil, and the freedom to grow in their own time. Maeve looked out at the brilliant colors with the quiet, simple satisfaction she held for everything made with her own two hands, neither boasting about the success nor diminishing the hard work it had taken to achieve it. She turned her head to look up at him, a tiny, familiar smile forming at the corner of her lips, the specific look she kept entirely for him when they were alone in the big house. She looked into his ice-blue eyes and asked him with a soft, teasing tone if he still had need of a bride from the Barlow family. Cassian turned fully away from the window, his white hair catching the light as he reached down and took both of her small hands in his own cold fingers. He drew her gently toward his chest, holding her close against the black wool of his coat, and leaned down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her forehead. He looked down at her face with the deep, careful attention he brought to every single thing that truly mattered to his heart. He whispered into the quiet room that he had absolutely no need for a bride anymore, because he only had need of his true wife, the May light falling warm and golden across the polished floorboards around them. The bright afternoon sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the western hills, casting long, peaceful shadows across the wide lawn and the blooming rosebeds of the estate. Standing there in the quiet warmth of the library, wrapped securely in the steady embrace of the man who had spent centuries living in the absolute dark, Maeve looked out through the clear glass window toward the endless blue horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. She felt the cool, familiar texture of his pale fingers intertwined tightly with her own, a solid and constant reminder of the strange, beautiful path that had brought her to this high cliffside home. She thought about the long years she had spent in the small, crowded house in the village, moving through the rooms like an unremembered ghost, while everyone else claimed the light and the praise for the survival of their family. She remembered the cold fear of the storm on the night she had taken the contract, the driving rain against the car windows, and the hard, unyielding weight of the necessity that had pushed her to knock on this terrifying door. She realized then, with a quiet and settled certainty, that true love did not require a person to be the most beautiful, the loudest, or the first one chosen by the world. It only required two people to look past the shadows, past the defenses built against the coldness of life, and to see each other with absolute clarity for exactly who they were. The future lay before them like the vast, open sea, no longer a terrifying expanse of dark water, but a beautiful and quiet dawn waiting to be lived together in the warmth of the home they had built with their own honest hands.